Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sophie and I'm one of the Collections and Learning Curators at Colchester Museums, specialising in natural history. Today we are sharing with you a recent project which has connected us to a museum in New Zealand. And I'm joined in this presentation today by Ricky-Lee Erickson, who will be sharing their perspective of the project. At Colchester, we have three museums: the Natural History Museum, Holly Tree's Social History Museum, and of course, Colchester Castle. The Natural History Museum is housed in All Saints Church and it was opened in 1958. This year, we are excited to be at the start of an NLHF-funded redevelopment project. The current museum focuses on the local habitats of North East Essex, from the North Sea to the Wildlife Garden, and the collections, which were started in earnest in the 1950s by the museum curators, do the same. The collection is now stored at our Museum Resource Centre, with just a small percentage making up the displays at the museum. The collections include vertebrate and invertebrate specimens, as well as herbaria, minerals, rocks, and a large collection of local fossils, from Cretaceous echinoids to mammoth teeth. In 2018, we began a 3-year Ellerman-funded project, which centred around a trainee natural history curator. The project also provided funding for collections development, including significance reviews. And one of the first reviews we commissioned was for the taxidermy collection. Mounts are an important feature of the museum, but there are a lot of specimens not on display, many of which were of poor quality, and some unfinished specimens that were created by our in-house taxidermist in the 1990s. The review would be an important step in the redevelopment project, but it was also necessary as we needed to move the collection out of the store at the museum to the better conditions at the main store at the Museum Resource Centre. Pat Morris came to review the collection, and he was able to help us identify which were the star specimens and which could be considered as candidate for transfer. This collections review was the first of this scale for the natural science collections, and from around 1,000 specimens, 150 were identified as suitable for transfer, either because of being poor quality and duplicated in the collection, or not fitting the collecting policy. As with many other museum collections, I'm sure, there were some great specimens, and some not so great. The list for disposal was then taken through the pathway outlined in the Museum Association Disposal Toolkit, eventually being offered to the museum community through NatSCA. I think that the most important thing I learned from this process is to establish the procedure for determining recipients of specimens offered for transfer before offering them out. I completely underestimated the level of interest that some of these specimens generated. Those specimens pictured here are those that were requested the most: a Kākāpō, 2 Kiwi and 2 Tūī, and it soon became clear that a first-come, first-served system wasn't going to be suitable. We would like to take this opportunity to thank those museums who did express interest in these specimens for their patience while we reconsidered our approach. The whole collections team was involved in rethinking our processes, which required us to assess each request for specimens against criteria we felt important. These were mainly how they would be used for research and public access, but balanced with wanting to transfer to as many organisations as possible to maximise the impact of the transfers. Things changed once again when we were approached by a museum in New Zealand who was looking to acquire specimens of endemic species. In their application, it was clear that the Auckland War Memorial Museum represents an important resource in the ongoing research and advocacy of their native species. The specimens, if transferred, would contribute to their ongoing research. The desire to identify the geographic region the Kākāpō and Kiwi were collected from by comparing their DNA to fossil material was a really exciting prospect, and we could see how these specimens, for which we had no provenance, could make a real impact. The main distinction in this application, though, was the cultural significance of the specimens to Māori and to New Zealand. These specimens are treasured, culturally valuable objects, and not just scientific specimens. This request instigated further discussions around ethical considerations required for our procedures. Whether this proposed transfer would be repatriation, restitution, or none of the above, we decided to take a decolonising approach and to prioritise the transfer to museums who recognise the cultural importance of the specimens, in addition to the scientific importance. If such a transfer was not possible, we would then look at the most suitable home in the UK, and in this case there was a national museum with an existing research collection of Kākāpō that were interested. We were told a few times that this transfer would be hard work, but in reality it hasn't been much more work for us than the UK transfers. And from our point of view, the biggest piece of work was the application for the re-export licence for the Kākāpō, a process that has since been streamlined with a new application process brought in last year. I'm now going to hand over to Ricky-Lee to share their perspective on the project.
Thanks, Sophie. I'm going to be talking about the perspective from Auckland War Memorial Museum and Museum Tāmaki Paenga Hira in New Zealand. Auckland War Memorial Museum is one of New Zealand's major institutions. It holds collections of natural history, human history, and documentary and heritage. The natural sciences collections house over 680,000 specimens across botany, marine, entomology, and land vertebrates. Within the land vertebrates department, there are over 17,000 bird specimens. It is an active research institution, educational hub, cultural centre, and war memorial. And you can see some of the specimens shown on the slide here: mounts, eggs, skeletons, study skins, and wet specimens. The manu, or birds in this transfer, are taonga manu species. This means they are treasured. They have significance to many iwi or Māori tribes. Examples of this are in kai, food, kakahu, clothing or cloaks, as seen in this Kiwi cloak, whakatoki, proverbs, and tohu, environmental indicators. I'm going to go into the 5 species in more detail. The Kākāpō is a nocturnal flightless parrot. It is one of the world's most unique parrots. Unfortunately, there are fewer than 250 Kākāpō alive today, and their conservation status is threatened to nationally critical. This population of Kākāpō are actively managed in a predator-free precinct. The lesser spotted kiwi is the smallest of the 5 kiwi species. It was formerly widespread and is now confined to offshore islands and one mainland sanctuary, and there are about 1,900 birds. The North Island brown kiwi is the only kiwi in the wild in the North Island. There are roughly 26,000 birds. Their conservation status is non-threatened, however they are still actively predated on by dogs. And if you've been to New Zealand, you would have seen Tūī, the boisterous forest birds. They are widespread and their conservation status is not threatened. In fact, they are very threatening to other birds. We had 2 options for our proposal to the Collection Development Committee, which, if successful, would allocate funds to support the transfer. One option was to have the art shipping company GSS ship the birds, or Global Specialised Services. The second option was to have staff fly over to the UK, pack the birds, and then bring them back using cabin and cargo luggage. The second option was the cheaper option and provided the ability to follow tikanga or cultural protocols. The Collection Development Committee decided we should proceed with the hand carry option, which was also our preference, and they released funds for us to use for this transfer. We did get a quote from GSS to organise the documentation required for this transfer, but it seemed much too high from what research we'd done, so we decided to do the documentation ourselves. Firstly, we had to apply to amend our wildlife permit due to a technicality in the wording of our permit, which only covered wildlife that was accidentally killed or died of, quote, natural causes. Since these birds were likely killed for taxidermy and were coming into our possession after the Wildlife Act was enacted in the 1970s, we had to amend our permit to include these 5 specimens. This process was quite time-consuming. Since the birds were unprovenanced, consultation with iwi proved challenging as we didn't know where in New Zealand these birds came from. We did know that the Kākāpō likely came from the South Island in Ngāi Tahu's Rohe or region, so we were able to consult with them and gain their support for the transfer and the required permit. After securing this new wildlife permit, we went ahead with the CITES import application for the Kākāpō, which is CITES listed. This was a quick process by comparison. Once we had that, we gave Colchester the go-ahead to reapply for the UK export CITES permit. The initial UK export permit had unfortunately expired in the time that it took for us to get our New Zealand wildlife permit amendment. We then hired a customs broker to handle customs, import tax exemptions, and biosecurity inspections. There are no fumigation services in New Zealand, but in any case, we would not like fumigation to occur because of the potential damage to the bird's DNA. So biosecurity will involve a visual inspection, then it will go through 2 weeks in the freezer once it arrives at Auckland Museum. Acquisition documentation will also be required to ensure the birds are covered by Auckland Museum's insurance during transport. All in all, the documentation will end up costing around 600 New Zealand dollars, and we were quoted $5,000 from GSS. However, significant staff time was involved in preparing these documents, and it's likely that we would have needed to supply information for these documents if we had hired a third party. We are planning on taking samples from the Kiwi and Kākāpō to compare with DNA samples collected from subfossils found in middens across the country, as shown in these papers here, where they've had some success in tracking down which regions historic birds were from by comparing them to DNA found in fossil material. Hopefully we'll be able to narrow down the provenance of these birds. Unfortunately, we won't be able to do the same for Tūī, as these studies have not yet been undertaken. This has been a huge learning process for both Colchester and Auckland museums, and the first time that New Zealand birds will be repatriated from the UK to New Zealand, which is immensely meaningful to our museum. Having staff bring the birds back will allow for the appropriate cultural protocols to be followed, which is now being developed by Auckland Museum Collections and Māori development staff. The most challenging and time-consuming parts of this process have been the documentation, unsurprisingly. We are grateful for Colchester in choosing Auckland Museum to take over the care of these birds, which are taonga manu in their homeland New Zealand, and for their ongoing assistance and support in bringing these birds home. Thank you.
Now, thank you very much for that wonderful talk. Does anybody have any questions for Ricky? Questions? Oh, Helen.
I just wondered, you mentioned one of the benefits of the hand carry was the ability to respect cultural practices in the handling. So could you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so that will be something that will be followed by Auckland Museum staff when the birds are collected, hopefully later this year. There will be a ceremony at Colchester, and there'll be special materials used for the packing to protect the mana of those birds as they travel, and then they'll be received in another ceremony at Auckland Museum. This is the first time something like this has happened, so the collections and Māori development staff are working on developing this at the moment.
Great, thank you. I think we've got a question at the back.
Thank you very much. It was just with regards to redistributing the specimens, how Auckland became aware that you had the material, or Auckland, how you became aware that the material was available. So where was it advertised?
It was advertised in the NatSCA mailing list.
Oh,
So what I didn't mention in the talk was that we had contacted Colchester through that mailing list and registered our interest for those specimens, in which case it was clear that they'd already received lots of requests for those exact specimens, and that's when they instituted sort of an application process where you'd have to justify your desire to obtain the birds, and so we provided that application back to Colchester, and luckily they selected us to be the recipients of the birds.
Any further questions? Oh.
This is more pondering, really. Our collection is the university collection, and it's become obvious that a lot of our old specimens have come from that used to provide specimens for universities. Is it Gerard's is one of them? And so there's a possibility that a lot of our collections were obtained not in the best way. Has anyone else done anything about this or looked into it or thought about it? It just struck me that one of our specimens, the Kiwi, and that there were quite a lot of Australian and New Zealand specimens in our collection, and we know that they obviously come from these countries that used to provide specimens.
Sorry. Was that a question for me or Ricky-Lee or anyone?
On the spot. It was more like a pondering for everyone. If anyone any thoughts along these lines? I guess I've got not exactly an answer, but an alternative responsive pondering.
I was going to respond to that.
Answer.
So in terms of thoughts of Gerard's specimens, so I'm from the Kākāpō Museum. Our collection was mostly formed by a game hunter in the late 20th century. I know through the records that we have in our archive that Kākāpō was supplying specimens to Gerard's and also wrote a word for resale to other institutions. So it's quite possible that the things that Gerard's were selling came from people like that, or colonial officers who collected things. But tracking down the provenance of those specimens, so it's quite hard to imagine. I know that there isn't a Royal War archive. I really want there to be a Royal War archive because we have a load of correspondence, but obviously I only have half the conversation because we don't have the rest. But I don't know if the Gerard's archive this. I don't believe so. I've looked for some lots of theirs, trying to find more information on some advanced specimens that we purchased from Gerard's. But yeah, I think it's a total blend of colonial connections and sellers and collectors. So yeah, it's different.
Okay, I think it's time to move on since I'm now 5 minutes late. But no, we'll just thank you so much to Ricky and Sophie for joining us. I have a feeling it might be near midnight, if not beyond. But thank you. So we go on to our next speaker. It's Pauline Rutter.